Hey everybody, how's it going? Today we'll be doing more deck jamming. This time we're switching to the co-op side and playing the big boys at Tech. Now I know you're probably sick of this deck by now, but really, it's just like Tag Me Max. This is one of the most fun decks I've seen since Kitara Cycle started coming out. It espouses everything that I enjoy about Netrunner. The fair traditional aspect of Netrunner where you manually advance agendas. The fact that this deck is very robust, you know, you can't easily hate it out on the runner side, and you know, it's a very well constructed deck. You never feel like your engine is choking because you didn't include enough consistency. The deck is very consistent, and you also get to enjoy the bluff element that people enjoy about Netrunner so much, in bluffing your agendas as NGOs, your NGOs as agendas, and everything unadvanced. It's lovely Netrunner. And I'll finally be giving it a spin today. We'll be watching me play the NBN deck for once instead of playing against it. Let's go! So today we are up against Max X, which is typically quite an open-ended Anarch ID. As with most Anarch IDs, you can't really tell what archetype they are on at first glance. The most that you can infer is that they're running Black Orchestra as their decoder. That's really all you can infer. I'm just going to go out on a limb here and guess that my opponent is on Rogue Trading, Tag Me Max, since, you know, that's the in thing, I guess. But we'll see how it goes. Now, my opponent's max mill basically confirms the archetype as they mill a DDoS into the bin. Yeah, that looks like Tag Me Max. So they run R&D here, and I'm going to let them get a single access. Can't afford the rest of the toll booth anyway. You also notice that I named Event for At Tech, which is typically what you do unless in extraneous circumstances like playing against guys. Now my opponent follows up by running HQ and Archives, and I'm like, that's not Tag Me Max. Oh dear. Okay, so we got board wiped turn 1. No big deal. I mean, if I were to be completely honest, I'd rather be board wiped turn 1 than say turn 7 or 8, because you know, losing two pieces of ice actually is fine. Losing 8 pieces of ice, much less so. Unfortunately, that's all my end runs exhausted. The next best thing I have to defend HQ, which now has a 1 in 3 agenda rate, is the Archangel, which doesn't do anything at all. So I'm just going to concede R&D here as they continue pilfering cards from the top of my R&D. Not very nice. Could definitely have used that Rashida. And so that's the first thing I'm noticing playing this deck for the first time. Even though it has a relatively defensive agenda suite, the fact that you're running 6 copies of card assets that cost 1 to trash makes it rather vulnerable on centrals. You know, my opponent can easily hammer R&D and HQ, trashing the NGOs and Rashidas for basically free. I'm not too happy with that, so when I drew the Endless Eula, I knew I had to put it on R&D. Even though I much rather Endless Eula as an remote ice, knowing that I can easily drag my opponent through it multiple times. However, the fact that my opponent's getting lots of single accesses combined with the fact that they are on Apocalypse means that I need to shore up my centrals first. Now this made my face lit up. I found my one-off Architect. Architect's an absolutely amazing ice in this matchup because my opponent cannot destroy my Architect with Apocalypse. So it's going to really help defend my R&D here, and I need to make it pull through. The problem is, it's not in the best position. It's this outermost ice on R&D. And I know that my opponent's running DDoS, so we can't allow my opponent to fire DDoS and then run R&D. We need to have a third piece of ice on R&D, force them into the Architect into Eula server. That would be pretty taxing to break in my opinion. So when I drew the IP block here, I was strongly considering placing it on R&D. I mean, obviously it's not remote ice. I mean, disregarding the fact that they don't have a paperclip in bin, they can easily break the IP block simply by out-tracing it. So at this point, it's quite obvious that I'm not going to attempt to score agendas just yet. I am still looking to set up my board state, especially my centrals, to prevent another apocalypse. If I get apocalypse a second time, I basically lose this game. We can't have that. So I'm setting up my money with Marilyn. You'll notice that I'm still relatively poor despite having no rezzed ice because my opponent has played an employee strike. They don't have much in the way of setting up their board state, but they have certainly disabled my economy. So getting the Marilyns up is pretty key. Now I draw into more agendas. It's not looking good, but I know that since I've committed Euler and Architect on R&D, I might as well go all the way with IP Block on R&D as well. Compare that to HQ, which has a very useless Archangel sitting there guarding it. Not exactly what I want to show up. My opponent can come into HQ for free, I'll let them do that. So yeah. Thankfully, they're pretty distracted by my remotes. They seem to be running pretty aggressively on them, trashing one of my ashes. Obviously, you'd like to put ash behind a piece of remote ice, but I'm dedicating all my early ice to centrals to guard against apocalypse. As such, I had to take the risk, and my opponent called me on it. They trashed my ash. Not a big fan of that. Not much I can do. Now, most people will be tempted to put the Enigma on a remote here. Again, I know how badly I get wrecked by apocalypse. And if there's one way my opponent can circumvent apocalypse, it's by, or rather the ice on R&D, it's by rebirthing into Omar and then sieging, getting into R&D through archives. Anarchs are very good at that, so we can't let that happen, so we need to guard archives in addition to R&D here. Now I'm going to continue drawing up here, and I see a pop-up window. Again, this is not a remote ice, this is definitely a central ice, and I'm going to put it on archives because at this point Archives Ice is actually more meaningful than HQ Ice given that it can defend against Omar runs. Whether my opponent rebirths into Omar or not, they have to run Archives anyway if they want to fire off Apocalypse, so might as well put lots of ice there to deter them. Now they finally hit my HQ, which is a very smart thing to do. At this point, I'm agenda flooded. They should know that, they should know HQ has a bunch of agendas, but I'm going to punish them with an Archangel Trace here that they can afford to boost, but it's too expensive. 6 credits is a lot. So instead, I'm just going to bounce the trope, which will set them back about 5 turns worth of trope counters. I'll take that any day. The fact that they're running trope clues me into the fact that they're not running levy. Basically confirmed by the fact that they have employee strike active. That's their restricted card. So no levy, they're relying on trope to recur their stuff. So disrupting the trope is pretty key. Now I raised the Amani Sanai there before the HQ access, given that my opponent has 60% chance of hitting an agenda, but they whiffed. So, So, unfortunately, we won't get to see the Amani Sanai trace. But hey, the Mani is going to be sitting there being really annoying to my opponent as they continue aggressively checking my remotes, this time seeing a duplicate G's model Baroids that they don't trash. They continue setting up the same old things, and I'm starting to wonder if they're really, and you know, what their plan is. They don't seem to be setting up for an apocalypse. They're just targeting my remotes again and again and plinking at HQ. Seems very curious as a game plan. I think at this point they're just committed to remote locking. So it's time to dedicate some of my ice to a remote. The next ice that I'll draw hopefully will be an Endless Eula. I can place down the remote and start dragging my opponent through it. Of course, being wary about subsequent DDoSes. So we continue seeing a bunch of setup turns, and yeah, at this point I'm still relatively poor. The E-Strike has really cost me a lot of money. But now I finally draw into my first remote ice, an Enigma. Well, it's not the best ice, but against an Anarch, I won't complain about something that taxes the runner for 3 credits. Still pretty good. The question is, do I jam a Mani Sanai or an agenda? Both are viable options, huh? I'm going to put an agenda in here, because I think at this point the runner thinks, isn't this a bit too obvious? They're trying to drag me through the remote. You know, you wouldn't put an agenda behind a single piece of ice knowing that I'm on DDoS and I have all the bin breakers in the bin. So I played the double bluff there, and the double bluff worked out. My opponent went to setup instead of contesting my ice remote, thinking that it was a bluff. And I'm gonna get the Amani Sanai trigger regardless, which is going to tax them 3 credits. I'll take that any day, right? That's so cool. Alright, so we are on the board. We have a Bill scored. Now all we need to do is to get the other 4 agendas out of our hand. I'm going to make this look like an agenda. I'm going to toss the Azmari Sanai here, making my opponent think, oh shit, he is rushing agendas. He's pumping them through the remote again and again. I need to run the remote this time, and I think I can induce a run this time. Right? They might be trying to set up for an apocalypse here. But I do have enough money to rest my central ice. The fact that they ran the Azmari first click means that they're not going to apocalypse me. Instead, they're going to trash the Azmari first before contesting my so-called agenda. A pretty smart move, except that it's yet another Azmari in the remote. They're going to spend 6 credits to get their Black Orchestra out and break the Enigma, only to see the second Azmari. Are they going to trash it this time? It's a tough choice. Having trashed the first one, you'll be very inclined to trash the second one as well, but my opponent made the right choice to not trash it. The biggest reason why you shouldn't trash it is because this is my scoring remote. Right now, my limiting factor is not money, it's not assets, it's not agendas, it's ice. I don't have resources for a second scoring remote. So if I want to score any further agendas, I need to override the Azmari Sanai. Why bother trashing an Azmari Sanai that the corp is going to override themselves anyway? So my opponent played that very smart, and I'm basically forced here to decide whether I want to jam a corporate sales team or to wait one more turn. Every turn I wait is losing ground to my opponent, because all I'm doing is clicking for credits while they are making very efficient use of their turns. They're getting trope counters, they're getting daily cast money, and they get to replay their strike, as you see here. So every turn that passes is, is advantageous for the runner and disadvantageous to me. I need to keep dragging my opponent through the remote, so I'm going to do it here. Rashida goes in the remote. Going to force my opponent to pay 4 credits here if they want to deny my Rashida. And of course they do. At this point, the remote is hardly taxing enough for them to consider whether to run or not. 3 credits, you just run and then click for 3 credits. My opponent's breaking even. I need more ice on the remote to really tax them out. So click once, draw, and I find 5 agendas in my hand. That's not good. I don't have any more bluffing materials, so the best I can do is to toss a sales team in the remote, which I'm fine with, because my opponent's on 0 points, so leeching this, or rather losing this 2-point agenda is not the worst in the world. Not gonna get Azmari Sanai trigger since my opponent trashed my Azmari, but, well, you make do with what you have, right? The Azmari has already done its job. My opponent had to pay 4 to trash it, and they had to pay 3 into the BU trace, so, I'm coming out ahead already. Now I find a second piece of ice, which means it's time to jam yet another agenda. This time the corporate sales team behind a vanilla. The vanilla is not going to tax a lot, it's a 1 credit tax, but because my opponent hasn't installed paperclip, it's going to suck up another 4 credits, which they probably don't want to spend here. Are they going to run the remote? They sure will, but are they? Are they not going to contest my remote? They're spending their first click to use trope here. They've decided they had enough, it's time to pop the trope and get some cards back. So they're getting about 5 or 6 cards back. Could have been 10 or 11, but they got Archangel. Remember that Archangel Fire? That was pretty key. I like that I've basically limited the amount of recursion my opponent has. Right? Otherwise they can get a lot of tools back. Now I'm paying very close attention to the cards that my opponent is reshuffling back into the deck, or rather putting back in the empty stack, because this determines what sort of strategy they'll be going with. I'm looking very closely at the third card in the bin, the Apocalypse, and realize they are not actually aiming to get the Apocalypse back, which really surprised me. I guess they just decided that they wouldn't have enough money to run all 3 centrals. So instead, they're going to recycle a lot of money, a DDoS, a run amok, and a rebirth. They are going to rebirth into Omar? Omar! Against a corp with 2 eyes on archives. We take those, right? We take those. I'm not complaining here. I'm going to score my corporate sales team. I'm going to go up 4 points and have this steady drip economy going for me. That's a big advantage to me. And you'll notice that I sneakily ditched a duplicate corporate or sales team in my archives for 2 reasons. Firstly, I have no use for the sales team anymore. It's an agenda I don't want to score. At 4 agenda points, I want to score either a big bill or global food to outright win the game. I have no use for the sales team, so it's going in the bin. Secondly, I know that my opponent will most likely never run the bin outright, because they've just rebirthed into Omar. That was perfect timing. They would rather make an Omar run than to run Archives directly. So the Omar run here, going to HQ, I was very worried about having my food sniped, but instead they hit the Archangel. Very unlucky snipe by my opponent, allowing me to get a Trace 6 off. This is a huge tempo swing in my favor. They're obviously not going to pay into the Trace, but I'm going to make them lose 3 credits essentially by bouncing Black Orchestra back into the hand. It was between that and Turntable, but Turntable is pretty much blank at this point. They don't really need the memory, and they don't really need the Turntable effect. So I bounce the Black Orchestra, and here you see the wisdom of ditching an extra agenda into the bin. With fewer agendas in my hand, the chances of my opponent hitting the sales team and swapping it for my loaded sales team with Turntable are that much lower. It also lowers the chance of them hitting an agenda. So I was very happy with the line of play I made, and I'm going to attempt to score the global food over here. So I'm very happy with the way things are going right now. My opponent's nowhere near match point, and they don't seem to, they still need 3 more agendas to win, or 2 more agendas if they use the Mad Dash in their bin. I'm slowly exhausting their options as they are forced to pop a DDoS just to avoid my outermost Archangel here. While they most certainly will be able to get into this remote and steal my food, I still have 2 bullets left in my gun. I have a Bill ready to go, I have a global food ready to go. Either of those cards could win me the game. And if my opponent did not run that remote right there and then, I would have won, because I would have played Biotic Labor and advanced the food 5 times. With the extra G's click and the Biotic Labor click, I can advance a card from 0 to 5 in 1 turn. So here I'm going to basically guarantee my victory, stretch my opponent's clicks very thin by installing Ashen Food in the defended remote and Bew in the naked remote. My opponent, if they want to deny me the win, they have to run the Bew, and then they have to run my defended remote twice because there's an Ash in there. I knew that was not going to happen. They may have been able to steal either the Bew or the food, but as long as they don't steal both, I can advance whichever agenda remains on the table, in this case the Bew, for the win. Boy, would I have played this game very differently if my opponent actually recurred Apocalypse with Trope. That was the one card I was playing around the entire game. You know, I basically spent half the commentary talking about how I'm defending against Apocalypse, how I'm icing Archives to defend against Omar running in to get the Apocalypse trigger. And honestly, it wasn't that difficult for my opponent to do. They actually went halfway there in rebirthing into Omar. If they went all the way and attempted an Apocalypse turn, all they needed was 11 credits. I did the maths. They could bypass R&D entirely, bypassing my Architect, bypassing my Euler, Apocalypse me, and I would have no way to recover after that. That would have been my opponent's out, but I guess they did not see that one. And yeah, Archangel really coming to play this game. In fact, the Archangel that was in my hand arguably did more work than the Archangel that was installed and res on HQ. Yeah, it basically was a 3 credit speed bump for the runner as they were forced to reinstall their Black Orchestra. Sometimes Archangel's actually best kept in hand rather than installing, because it pads your hand out, gives you some way to, you know, threaten an ambush from hand, make HQ runs more deterring and as such. Particularly against Anox. Some other runners might have better solutions against it, but Anox, if their best solution is Black Orchestra, they're gonna struggle. Also note that, interestingly, you cannot you cannot really let the trace fire. It's a very high base trace, and ad tech's usually rich enough to boost the trace if they want to, so that they'll force something valuable to be bounced. In this context against Max, there wasn't really much value to be bounced, but it was still a speed bump, which synergizes very well with the other cards in this deck. Cards like Azmari Senai, which all serve to, you know, create this differential in tempo. Slow the runner down by sapping the credits. That's what Archangel did by bouncing the Black Orchestra. Azmari did the same. 3 credit speed bump when I scored the Bew, and they still had to pay even more to trash the Azmari. That's 4 credits. And the second Azmari that was used as remote bait, my opponent went to check it behind an Enigma that cost them 3 credits to break. Despite my opponent's decent economy suite consisting of power cards like Day Job and Liberator accounts, I still managed to successfully get them down to a very poor state at the end of the game, such that I could score out behind a global food behind an Ash. Ash is an amazing card that can really pull a lot of work when the runner is poor, and that's exactly how I basically guaranteed my endgame victory. A lot of the times, especially in the early to mid game, you are banking on the NGO mind game, the bluffing game, where the runner is like, I don't really want to run it. It's probably an NGO, but even if it's an agenda, I can let them score it and, you know, contest a later one. That's typically how it goes early to mid game, but in the late game, when the runner is very set up and have all the economy available, your only hope is the Ash, and Ash really pulls through, especially if your Azmari, Sanais, and Archangels have been previously doing work. Oddly enough, it is Azmari Agtag's ability that was lackluster this game, mostly because my opponent went the extra mile to deny my identity with Employee Strike. Despite this deck's robustness in economy, it runs so much economy. Burst assets, strip assets, my ID, and of course, show gamble and IPO. Sorry, hedge fund and IPO, that's a mistake, sorry. But if you realize, actually, my opponent did a very good job denying 3 of the 4 economic fronts. They trashed my NGO fronts and Rashidas from centrals, and also denied 1 Rashida in my remote. They actively actually trashed the Maryland campaigns, which was actually really annoying. I was really banking on them for money, but they end up in the bin. And of course, Azmari never really got to fire, so I was stuck clicking for credits most of the game, which felt pretty bad. This also enlightens me to how the big boys ad tag deck could struggle if the runner actually puts in effort into denying all these money cards. I never got an NGO front off. I only got 1 Maryland's worth of money and only a couple of credits from Azmari. So yeah, you can actually struggle quite a bit. You need to threaten to res your ice, especially against an Apocalypse deck, and I just didn't really have that money this game. Well, it was a good experience finding that out. If you have been paying attention, you'll notice that all the cards I've talked about so far all begin with the letter A, because this is an A deck. Amazing deck, and I really love how all these A cards come together to help you gain money as the corp and help establish that credit differential, corp versus runner, make the runner poor, and you know, just make it impossible for them to contest that thick remote server with the Ash in it, and Archangel defending your centrals, Azmari giving you money. Apocalypse, of course, is the one big counter, but thankfully we survived the Apocalypse and we won this game. Thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you next time.